for joining this afternoon. Today, as mentioned, we're going to be talking about nicotine products, which is a really hot topic these days. If you haven't been with us before for one of our parent webinars, welcome. We are from Partnership to End Addiction. I'm joined here with my colleague, Dr. Linda Richter. My name's Corey, and we also have our Associate Director, Janelle Robinson, who is on our team. And this is what we're going to be going over today. So first, we'll do a brief overview of what substance use in adolescence looks like and how nicotine products fit into that. We'll talk a lot about vaping. We'll talk about the different kinds of vapes, how vapes came about, how common they are, and some of the trends in youth among those who use vapes. We'll also talk about oral nicotine products. When we used to do this presentation, we would only talk about vaping and it would be called nicotine vaping. But we've since switched it to nicotine products because these oral nicotine products are becoming more and more popular among youth. And so we want to make sure that those are included as well. So we'll talk about those, what they look like, how common they are. And then we'll talk about why nicotine use is concerning. We'll talk about some of the reasons why youth might be motivated to use nicotine and how we can keep youth safe. We'll also go over some resources, both through our organization, but also outside of us, and hopefully have some time for questions at the end. And as we're going through this, if you have questions that pop up, please feel free to use the chat function and we'll get to them at the end. But I'm going to jump right in because we only have an hour here and a lot of information to get through. So what does substance use in adolescence look like? We usually start a lot of our substance use talks with this slide to help anchor us. Adolescence is the age 12 to 17, and it is a critical period for addiction risk. Research shows us that young people who first use any substance before the age of 18 have a 1 in 4 chance of developing addiction, whereas if they wait to start using substances until after 21, that risk is reduced to 1 in 25. And this is because the adolescent period is a time of intense brain development. And we know that introducing substances while the brain is still developing can be really harmful and can lead to this increased risk for addiction later in life. We know that adolescence is the developmental stage that is most vulnerable to initiating and experimenting with substances because they're more likely to take risks and they're more likely to do things spontaneously. But it's also the time that those consequences are at the highest because that brain is still developing, legal consequences, all of these things. And so when it comes to the different types of substances, what does this look like? This graph has a lot on it, but these are the substances that are most popular with youth. And this is the percentage of young people who were using these things last year in 2024. So you'll see there's alcohol, things like having been drunk before, using flavored alcohol, marijuana use, and then the arrow is pointing to the vaping nicotine bars. Alcohol and marijuana are still the most commonly used substances among young people, but we can see here that vaping nicotine is a close third. So about 21% of high school seniors last year had used a nicotine vaping device in the last year. But we also know that not using is really the norm among teens. We're going to talk a lot about nicotine products and how dangerous they are and how much we don't want kids to use them. But we need to remember that the majority of kids are not using these things. The rates of kids who are lifetime abstainers, so those who have never tried any substance, including alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, or other drugs, is increasing year after year. And that's what this graph shows. As of last year, 72% of 8th graders, 58% of 10th graders, and 42% of seniors were lifetime abstainers and had never used anything. So this is really kind of encouraging news that we want to take with us as we're learning more about nicotine. So let's jump into nicotine vaping, first of all. And I wanted to start our discussion on vaping by thinking about kind of where we've come with tobacco use. And so this is showing, this is a survey called the Monitoring the Future survey that surveys 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And we'll talk about this survey a lot in this discussion today. But this combines 8th, 10th, and 12th graders and just shows lifetime cigarette use over time. And I included just kind of random periodic time points throughout the past 25 years or so here. So we can see that, in 1995, for example, almost 56% of students said that they had smoked cigarettes before. And that's a lot, more than half. Whereas if we look at last year in 2024, we can see that just over 9% of students said that they had ever tried cigarettes. It's the lowest it's ever been. And public health experts and public health professionals did this by, we did a lot of things to try to reduce cigarette use in the past many decades. Things like making cigarette smoking illegal indoors, increasing the legal age of purchase to 21, taxing them really heavily and making them really expensive, making advertising them to young people illegal, huge anti-smoking ad campaigns. And so cigarettes slowly over the decades became harder to get, more expensive, and less cool. And so it was a win for public health. And so we were really kind of jazzed and encouraged by how low rates of cigarette use were. But then, of course, vaping came onto the scene and kind of changed the nicotine landscape. So what is vaping? So vaping is the act of inhaling and exhaling the aerosol, often referred to as vapor, kind of a misnomer because it's not just water vapor. There's a lot in it. That's produced by an electronic cigarette or a similar device. And so there's many different types of vapes and they all kind of look different, but they all share similar components. So there's a cartridge or a pod that is holding this e-liquid. There's a heating element called the atomizer that then heats up the liquid. There's a power source, a battery, whether either it's a disposable one or a rechargeable one. And then there's a mouthpiece where someone would inhale from. So this is our new adversary from the tobacco industry. Since we did so well fighting off cigarettes, they brought these onto the scene. And there's been several generations of vaping devices in the past 15 years or so. These first kind of came onto the market, you'll see on the far left, around 2007. And those were ones that they were called ciga-likes because they were made to look like cigarettes. But they would just have a little light on the end and they were electronic. Most of these were disposable. Some of them you could recharge. The second generation, moving to the right, were these vape pens that had longer battery life, and you could use kind of your e-liquid of choice. You could switch out these cartridges at times. Then they moved on to this third one called mods, which were much bigger. Some of them kind of look like walkie-talkies. They're like pretty big hunks. And they have the benefit of even longer battery charge, the ability to customize a lot of the component parts. People really kind of went wild with making their mods very specific to their use, buying a lot of new parts, changing them out. And these produce the huge clouds of aerosol that you might have seen. And then the fourth generation was the pod-based ones, where the component part is rechargeable, but then the pod is what's disposable. They kind of look like flash drives. They're rechargeable using USB ports, which made them very convenient. And the disposable pods often contained flavorings, nicotine, sometimes THC and marijuana. This was Juul, which was the very popular one. And as with each generation, more and more amounts of nicotine were in these, making them pretty addictive. And so what it looks like currently is we've kind of moved the pods are still popular to an extent, but a lot more people are using what are called disposables. So that would be, if you look in this picture in the yellow, kind of the green one. Um, these are sleek, they're often very colorful, kind of have a high-tech appearance. They can often look like highlighters or pens. They're easy to hide, easy to discard, and these are not rechargeable. These are kind of one and done. So you buy one, you use it till it's dead, and then you throw it away. And these come in a whole host of flavors. 88% of students who vape said that they use flavored products. And usually, majority of kids that are vaping are using fruity flavors, and then about 40% are using mint or menthol, then a smaller proportion are using kind of sweet candy flavors. So a little bit more about these disposables. In 2024, the most popular were these disposables, followed by the pre-filled or refillable kind of pods or cartridges like Juul. So, at the peak of the vaping epidemic, which, as we'll see in a few slides, was around 2019, Juul and these pod-based ones were very much the rage. The popularity of Juul began to wane, primarily because of a crackdown by the FDA on the flavored pods and cartridges. The companies got around that law by creating these disposable ones in flavors. These are not as tightly regulated, and these rely on nicotine salts, which is a slightly less, uh, not, it doesn't provide a burn like a traditional cigarette would, which helps them to be a little bit more appealing to youth. Popular brands of these disposables are Elf Bar, Puff Bar, Breeze, Fuse, Juul. There seems to be a new brand every time you go into a gas station. But the problem with these is that there's been this kind of nicotine arms race, and that they're consistently trying to put more and more nicotine in these. And so you can see that in this infographic here. One pack of cigarettes is 20 cigarettes and has about 22 milligrams of nicotine. A Juul pod had almost double that amount, and so it was one pod was more than a pack. So it was about 37 cigarettes, depending on the intensity and the flavor that you got. And then some of these disposables have really kind of taken that to the next level. So some of these kind of chunkier Elf bars can have up to 650 milligrams of nicotine in it, which would be equivalent to almost 600 cigarettes. And so there's a wild amount of nicotine in these products, and young people might not kind of relate in their mind how many cigarettes or how much nicotine is in these vape devices that they're using. And so they're unfortunately becoming more and more concentrated with nicotine. And so let's look at how common nicotine vaping is. This graph, the bars on the left are middle school numbers and the bars on the right are high school numbers. And you can see these are over time. So starting in 2018, and then on the far right in the darkest color is the most recent data from 2024. And so we can see the light purple bar for each was 2019, and that's when vaping was really at its peak. About almost 28% of high schoolers in 2019 said that they had vaped in the past month, so would be considered current vapors. And you can see since then it's tapered off and it's been decreasing. 2020, it makes sense. A lot of kids were not at school in person. They were a lot of them were doing school at home during the pandemic. A lot of kids get vapes from their friends, so it makes sense that vaping really decreased that year. But it's really kind of, as opposed, with the exception of a few blips, it's really decreased since then. And it's important to note that, these vaping devices, the tobacco industry will tell you that they are meant for adults and they are not meant for people under the age of 21. But we know that adults are vaping at rates much lower than kids. In 2021, about 4.5% of adults were current vapors, those who used vapes. And if we compare that to the high school number that same year in 2021, it was over 11% of high schoolers had used a vape in the past 30 days. Um, so as much as they want to say that adults are their target audience, we know that a much higher proportion of high schoolers are using vape devices compared to adults. So that is something that we really need to take into account, that, their um, intended audience, they're getting a lot of money from high school students is what I'll say there. Um, we also know that teens are not just experimenting with vaping devices. Many of them, if they are using them frequently, and a lot of them are using them daily. So of students who vaped in the past 30 days last year, in high school, about 42% of them were would be considered frequent users, so using on 20 or more days in a month, and almost 30% were daily users. So we're using every single day. Um, and it's still high for high schoolers. For high schoolers or for middle schoolers who used in the past 30 days, about 27% were frequent users and almost 16% were using every day. So for those who are vaping, they're doing a lot of it, unfortunately. When students were asked how easy it would be to get vaping devices, um, almost 70% of high school seniors said it would be fairly easy or very easy to get a vaping device. And then when asked if they saw great risk in vaping occasionally or regularly, only a little over half of 12th graders said that they saw great risk in vaping regularly. So not only are these devices easy to get for young people, a lot of young people don't see a whole lot of harm in using them occasionally or even frequently. Um, so we really need to raise awareness among young people about how dangerous these devices are. And from a policy perspective, do what we can to try to make them less accessible to young people. So how are young people getting them? Um, we know that teens said that they're fairly easy to get. And you can see from this graph here, this breaks it up into two different age categories. So the purple bar is those 13 to 17, and the orange bars are those 18 to 20. So for all of these people, it's illegal to buy a vaping device. But for those underage, how are they getting them? And so you can see that the younger teens are more likely to get vapes from someone they know, and those 18 to 20 years old are more likely to get them from a retail store, even if it's still illegal for them to buy it from a retail store. And then they asked kids about the different types of stores and places that they were getting them. When it came to retail stores, the most popular kind of retail store was a smoke shop. That seems pretty intuitive. When it came to online sources, um, multi-brand e-cigarette websites, so things like vapor.com, were most popular with teens. But almost 20% of young teens who bought them from online sources were getting them from Amazon. When it comes to home delivery apps, the most reported home delivery app for young people was GoPuff. And then less popular, but still on the list, were things like DoorDash and Postmates. When it comes to social media, the most popular was Snapchat. 40% of kids who bought vapes from social media were getting them from Snapchat. Then Instagram was the next most popular. And when they were asked who on social media they were buying vapes from, about a third of 13 to 17-year-olds said that they were getting them from a friend who's older. And then about a third said that they were getting them from friends their own age. And you may be wondering, kind of like I was, if teens are getting them from online retailers and retail shops, how are they doing that? Are they not being asked their age? Are they not being ID'd? And so this same survey looked at that as well. And they asked kids, if you've vaped in the past month and when you were buying it, did anybody ask you to verify your age. And you can see that only about a quarter of those aged 18 to 20 were asked all the time for their age verification. Um, Almost 30% of that same age category said no, they were not asked to verify their age at all. And about 15% of those younger teens, 13 to 17-year-olds, said that they had never been asked to verify their age. And so we know it's relatively easy for young people to get these, despite all of the efforts we've made to reduce access. And certainly selling tobacco products to these age groups is illegal. But we know that the clerks at these tobacco shops, the vape stores, gas stations, and certainly the online retailers are not following those laws and verifying age like they're supposed to. And there's certainly fewer kids buying them online, but there was another study that found that it was pretty easy for kids to do so with about a 90% success rate. Since those kind of the age gates that they put on these websites are pretty easy to get around. Um, so in this same survey, only about a third of young people said that they had ever been denied the ability to buy a vape because of their age. And so about 20% of teens said that if they were asked their age, they were either showing the ID of someone else that they know or showing a fake ID. So we know that there's a lot of ways around the laws. And if kids are intent on buying these, there's certainly places where they can do that. This graph shows the reasons why students say that they vape. The orange bar is 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who had vaped even just once in the past year. And then the purple bar is high school seniors who report vaping nearly every day. So trying to show the difference between those who are maybe just using kind of casually compared to those who are using every day. Those who vape every day are much more likely to say that they vape because they're hooked, to say that they absolutely need it and they're addicted to it. For both groups, the most reported reason for vaping was to relax or relieve tension, which is certainly something that parents should be aware of. Over 70% of teens who are daily users said that they're doing it to relax or relieve tension. It can be easy to kind of brush off that young people will vape or use nicotine as a way to be kind of rebellious, or they're just doing it because they're bored. But the vast majority saying that they need it to relax or relieve tension. And so when we're thinking about trying to prevent this, we can find healthier ways to provide some relaxation and maybe some coping skills to young people to really help them through. Less common reasons for vaping were trying to quit regular cigarettes. Very small proportion of teens said that. Some said it's because it looks cool. About 13% said it's because it looks cool. But much more common was saying that they use it to relax. And so wanted to also touch on oral nicotine products. These might be kind of newer for many people watching this. Certainly vaping has been the talk of the town for many years now, but these are becoming increasingly popular. So we have synthetic nicotine oral products. So these are not tobacco-based. There's many different types of them. There are nicotine gums, there's lozenges, tablets, gummies, pouches, and these are not the prescribed therapies approved for smoking cessation. These often have much higher nicotine levels than those that would be prescribed to someone who's trying to quit smoking. They come in a whole host of flavors, a lot of candy-like packaging. Many will make health claims and say that they're tobacco-free, and that's because they use these synthetic nicotine salts, kind of like the vape products do. But again, they're very high in nicotine content and can be very discreet. And again, as government restrictions are tightening on tobacco and some of these vaping products, the tobacco industry needs to find new ways of getting young people hooked on nicotine. And so this is kind of the next wave of that. We wanted to focus a little bit on pouches because these are the most common of these oral nicotine products that young people are using. And this is a modern twist on the traditional chewing tobacco. It is smokeless, spitless, and tobacco-free. With more traditional smokeless tobacco that many of us might be familiar with, chewing tobacco, putting a lip in, dip, people needed to spit out that gross brown liquid, which is a lot of what made it unappealing to young people. It's really hard to hide that. With some of these new nicotine pouches, things like Zyn, maybe you've heard of, you don't have to do that. Swallowing the saliva can irritate your throat a little bit, but these are designed to minimize saliva production compared to kind of traditional dip or chewing tobacco. And so this makes it a lot more appealing to kids. But it's used in a very similar way. A pouch is placed between the lips and the gums, and it's absorbed through the mouth. As of last year, about 6% of 12th graders and 3% of 10th graders, less than 1% of 8th graders, had used these nicotine pouches in the past year. And that might not sound like a lot, but in 2023, it was only 3% of high school seniors. So the prevalence has doubled in a year of how many seniors are using these pouches. So it is becoming a lot more popular. And 3.5% of high school seniors said that they had used these in the past month. So that's what we would consider current use. And 3.5% of all high school seniors is still a pretty big number. So we do want to be aware of these. These are the most common brands that we see right now, things like Zyn, On, Rogue, Velo, Free. And a lot of the advertising around these is that there's no smoke, there's no spit. It's a really discreet, secretive way of getting your nicotine fix. And so now I'm going to pass it on to Linda to get into why nicotine use is concerning and some of the ways that we can keep youth safe around these products.
Thank you, Corey. I think you've touched on, or at least raised people's perceptions of why some of this is concerning, but I just kind of want to delve in a little bit deeper, and especially to kind of put it in the context of all the things that parents have to be concerned about, especially with regard to substance use. We're very concerned about what we're hearing around fentanyl and opioid use and prescription drug misuse and alcohol and marijuana and all sorts of other drugs. And sometimes from our experience, parents say, well, it's just vaping. It's just, nicotine. It's just this and that. It's not as concerning. It doesn't affect, sort of a child's life trajectory the way some of these other kind of substances can. So that all may be true to some extent, but there are still pretty significant things about nicotine that we do want to pay attention to when it comes to young people. So Corey, if you can go to the next one, thank you. So we're all very aware of the harmful chemicals and disease-causing toxic elements that that are in cigarettes, right? And that's kind of very well agreed upon that, cigarettes are awful for a person's health, and we certainly don't want our kids using it. But we want to understand, what about nicotine vaping products that don't have a lot of the elements that cigarettes have, still make them quite dangerous. So we know that cigarette smoke contains over 7,000 chemicals. It has, carcinogenic compounds and a whole range of other toxins. And e-cigarettes and vaping products and sort of those other synthetic nicotine products that Corey was mentioning may not have tobacco in them. They may not have the tar that we're concerned about with cigarettes, but they do contain things like, obviously, nicotine, which we'll talk about some more, a whole range of chemicals and ultrafine particles that seep deep into a person's lungs and have really significant effects on one's respiratory health. Most of these products contain flavors, and the chemicals that make the flavors are highly toxic in most cases and quite dangerous. There's a whole range of organic compounds, sort of these names of compounds that are typically found in things like car exhaust or paint or household, products that you really would not want to think about people inhaling into their lungs, especially our children. And also a whole range of heavy metals, things like nickel and lead, which are really toxic and dangerous. So we know that a lot of these chemicals and toxins are being found in the oral cells of people who use these products, and they cause changes to one's DNA, very similar to the way that we find these effects from cigarettes. And more studies are pointing to the links generally between nicotine vaping, nicotine product use, and respiratory effects, cardiovascular disease, and a whole range of other health problems, reduced immunology, immunological functioning, reproductive effects. And most importantly, what you'll hear a lot about are that the ingredients in these vaping products can cause cancer. So again, not to be overly alarmist, but we don't want to dismiss these products as being so much less dangerous than cigarettes just because they're not quite as horrible as cigarettes. They still contain a whole range of ingredients that are quite toxic, especially for young people. And then when it comes to nicotine itself, a lot of people, especially when these products first were coming out, were saying, well, hey, it's just nicotine. What's the big deal? If you don't have all those other, nasty ingredients that are in cigarettes, it's really not that bad. And even putting aside all those other chemicals that make up the flavors and all the other ingredients in an e-cigarette, in a vaping product, or in these oral nicotine products, let's just focus in on nicotine itself. There is quite a lot of research on what effects nicotine itself has. Number one, we know that it is extremely addictive. It is actually one of the most addictive substances around. And some evidence of that is from those statistics Corey was showing earlier, where of young people who do use these products, a pretty high number of them are using them frequently or every day. And that's because when you use these products, it's pretty, addiction sets in pretty quickly, and they become pretty hard not to use on a given day. We know that they change the developing brain, much like all forms of substance use do, and that those effects are stronger when you're talking about younger people whose brains are under development. Nicotine has really significant effects on a young person's attention, ability to learn, their mood, impulse control. Nicotine is a stimulant, central nervous system stimulant. So other substances that are stimulants you could think about are caffeine, cocaine, amphetamines. So nicotine is one of those and has those similar properties. And therefore, physically, it can increase blood pressure, respiration, heart rate, and overall, when used regularly and intensely, and especially in the high doses of nicotine that current products have, it can have significant effects on one's nervous system, cardiovascular system, respiratory system, and as I said earlier, reproductive system. So we really want to think about these effects and not just sort of dismiss it as like, oh, well, it's just nicotine. It doesn't have the other harmful effects of the cigarette. And just to kind of hone in a little bit on the addiction component of it, this is really what's been most striking to me over the past decade as I really kind of looked deeply into the issue of nicotine vaping among young kids. The addiction part of it is really significant, especially for young people. The nicotine content in these products, as I said, is very, very high, and most people who vape cannot stop easily on their own because of how addictive it is. So if someone does try to stop, they can have pretty intense withdrawal symptoms, very strong cravings. They can experience fatigue, irritability, difficulty concentrating. And we know that among younger people, most young people who use vaping products report that they have to use it within about 5 minutes of waking up. And that's more true than, users of cigarettes and all other tobacco products combined. So this measure of feeling like you need to use something within 5 minutes of waking up is a real marker of addiction, especially for young people. And we know that nicotine exposure affects the brain, increases vulnerability to other substance use, including marijuana and cocaine. And, we could talk about that in another presentation, but all substance use kind of feeds into other substance use, and most people who use one type of substance are at higher risk of using others. And this is especially true for nicotine. There's a lot of studies showing that kids who start out using nicotine vaping products end up using marijuana vaping products or marijuana in general, and possibly cocaine and other stimulants because their brain is sort of, becoming accustomed to the effects of the stimulating properties of nicotine. And then, this whole conception of, well, won't we rather people are vaping rather than smoking cigarettes? I'll say yes, that's probably true. However, vaping doesn't preclude smoking cigarettes. Teens and young adults who vape are almost 4 times as likely as those who do not to begin smoking traditional cigarettes. There's multiple studies on this. 4 times as likely is sort of the general average amount that we've been finding, but that number could be much higher. And when you're talking about even younger kids who are about 12 to 15-year-olds who vape, their risk of progressing to cigarette smoking is about 9 times as high as those who do not vape. So young people who vape nicotine don't typically stop there. And what ends up happening even for adults is they'll vape in places and times when they are not able to smoke cigarettes. The nicotine itself is so addictive that people tend to try and get it in any form that they can. So sure, if they can get it through vaping, that's great. And if they could smoke, then that sort of delivers the nicotine even more quickly to their brain and satisfies that addiction. So we also know that the use of multiple nicotine products is very common in young people. About 1 in 3 middle and high school students who use a nicotine product use 2 or more types. So they may not just focus in on vaping products or e-cigarettes. And we also know that a lot of people who are cigarette smokers, this is true of young adults and adults especially, who turn to vaping in order to reduce their cigarette consumption, end up becoming dual users, meaning they end up vaping in addition to the cigarette smoking because it is not always such an effective cessation tool. For most people, it doesn't really work. So what is it about vaping and nicotine use that is appealing to young people? What are some of the motivations for use? Corey touched on some of these earlier, like their reasons for using, but I just kind of want to go into it a little bit more, especially as we've seen that fewer kids are using. So the message has been coming out that, getting to them that this is maybe not that healthy, or maybe it's the policies that have restricted access a little bit that have helped. But there are still some significant reasons for why young people choose to vape nicotine. First and foremost, it is appealing and it is presented in an appealing way. So these images are kind of all around young people's neighborhoods, social media feeds. Essentially, the way these products are packaged and marketed, they're sold in a whole range of really appealing flavors and colors that are just right for young people. As Corey mentioned, they're very easy to hide and dispose of. So if a young person wants to vape and keep it out of sight of an adult, that's not hard to do at all. Unlike cigarettes, they don't have a very strong lasting smell. They sometimes have a very minor, mild, sweet sort of odor to them, which a young person could sort of attribute to perfume or hairspray or even makeup or whatever. They're relatively cheap and easy to access. They're sold illegally to young people, as Corey mentioned, in a whole range of smoke shops and gas stations and online. They're perceived as cool generally, and it's because it feels good. People use substances because they work to some extent. So nicotine gives a buzz. It focuses your attention. It gives you a little extra energy, I guess you could say. And it's highly addictive. Once someone starts, it becomes very hard to stop. As is true of any kind of substance use, especially when it comes to young people, there are a lot of environmental or societal factors that contribute to use. And especially with nicotine vaping, what we've seen is real glorification and normalization of use of these products in the media, through advertising. You know, it's just all around, and it is marketed and sold in a way that makes it seem cool and attractive and appealing and adult-like and glamorous, much like cigarettes were sold to young people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this was especially true when it was reaching its peak of appeal in like 2018, 2019. There were, you know, giveaways at concerts, at events, places where young people congregate. These products were really made to seem very cool, very glamorous, and relatively harmless. Um, they're really, you know, all over social media. So that's where young people are, and they are seeing people, you know, people that they admire using them. Um, there are not well-enforced policies around this. So policies can be very effective in reducing a young person's tobacco or nicotine use, as we've seen with cigarettes. But there's been a lot of back and forth in terms of the policies around vaping products and now these oral nicotine products. And there are many, many loopholes. The government is having a very hard time keeping up with the influx of these products from other countries. They're mostly illegal, what you're seeing sold in smoke shops and gas stations. They are not authorized by the government to be sold. But there's just not enough, frankly, manpower to kind of crack down on it. So these are widely available. And the policies that we do have, which are well-intentioned, are not well enforced. As we've seen, a lot of the marketing for these products is targeted to young people. As much as these companies say that they're meant for adults who want to quit smoking, the flavors that are available, the packaging, the colors, none of that is meant to appeal to an adult. These are meant to appeal to kids. And the reason that these companies want to appeal to kids, which was true of the cigarette industry as well, is because it's well known in the addictive product world that the younger you get someone hooked on your product, the more likely you are to have a lifetime loyal customer, which is, you know, for every type of addictive substance that's sold, we know that about 80 to 85% of the market or the money made off those products is from heavy users who use throughout their lifetime. So that is the goal for these products, is to get young people hooked early and to become lifetime intense users. We also know that there are more, you know, close to home sort of factors that influence a young person's use. So as is true for any kind of substance use, when a parent or trusted caregiver models use of the substance or acceptance of it, a young person is more likely to engage in that kind of substance use. So if a kid grows up in a home where parents are smoking or vaping, that's kind of conveying this notion that this is okay and normalized, and a young person will be at higher risk of doing the same. There's always the social pressure when it comes to young people's substance use. If they're in a friend group where it's the norm or where it's condoned, a young person is more likely to use. There's a lot of misinformation out there about vaping, that because it is, you know, less horrible than cigarettes, a lot of people don't believe it's particularly harmful. You don't see the same kind of societal negative consequences as you might from, let's say, alcohol use or other drug use, where someone may become very aggressive or, you know, commit some crimes or something like that, or drive recklessly. So it all seems less dangerous, but really it has very significant physical effects on the young person, both on their brain and body. If a young person isn't well monitored and supervised, if communication between parents and kids is not really effective and good, then those kids are going to be more at risk. Obviously, as is true for any kind of youth substance use, if there's family instability, if the family dynamics are not healthy, if there's a lot of stress in the home, a young person may turn to vaping to kind of relieve that stress. And also we see higher rates of vaping among kids who feel socially isolated or lonely. Again, these are common reasons for any kind of substance use, but we do see it with nicotine vaping as well. And then just to kind of bring that home a bit, one of the main risk factors for nicotine vaping, as is true for other forms of substance use, is to kind of self-medicate or cope with one's stress or mental health challenges, as Corey showed on that previous slide. So kids are not just trying to be bad and rebellious and, adult-like necessarily. When they're using these products, they're trying to fill a need. And often that need is a sense of stress, instability, anxiety that using these products temporarily at least helps alleviate. What we do know is that they're kind of go both ways. So if somebody uses a substance to alleviate their mental health problems, what ends up happening is that those mental health problems or stressors tend to increase actually as a result of the substance use. So we have this kind of bidirectional relationship between mental health challenges and vaping and other substance use. So what can we do to help kids and protect them from using these products that are all around them and that are pushed on them, honestly? Um, so one thing we need to do is know the signs. Like we can't react to something if we're not sure if it's even happening or not. So we just kind of want to inform ourselves as adults about what does it look like if a kid is vaping. So one thing you want to be aware of are sort of these faint smells of candy, fruit, mint, these kind of flavors that may be on or around the young person. So you may smell it on their clothing when you give them a hug, when they walk into the room, when you walk into their bedroom. If you see items around the house or their room that look like pens or flash drives or erasers, but kind of a little different, you might want to take a closer look. That's what these vaping products tend to look like nowadays. And you may find the actual pieces of evidence of a vape. So, cartridges or small bottles of e-liquids around their room. So you might want to just look around and see what's there. Um, on the person, him or herself, you might find that they're frequently thirsty. They have dry mouth, dry skin, frequent nosebleeds, and that's because nicotine is dehydrating. And so you may have a child who all of a sudden they're showing these symptoms. That's something to kind of be aware of. Kids who typically use a lot of caffeine, when they start vaping, they may reduce their caffeine intake because both are stimulants and it becomes too hard for them and sort of overwhelming in terms of the stimulant content. So if someone's vaping a lot, they may reduce some of their caffeine use. If they are frequently kind of jumpy and irritable and then they leave the room a lot when you're talking with them, or let's say when they're hanging out, and then they come back and they sort of seem a little bit more calm and a little less restless, that could be a sign that they're kind of going off to vape and sort of relieve that tension and then coming back. And as always, as is true for any kind of substance use, when you notice any kind of significant change in their behavior, something that's like more marked than usual, irritability, anxiety, restlessness, those are all signs that something may be going on. It could be vaping, it could be other substance use, it could be a mental health problem, but regardless, it's a reason for concern and it's a reason to have a conversation. And as we always really emphasize is when we do think that a young person might be vaping or using nicotine products, we don't want to just get mad at them and blow up and start punishing. What we want to do is understand the reason why they're doing this. Usually young people as well, do things for a reason. And the reason usually makes sense for them. So if they're vaping, there's usually a reason why. And what we want to do is understand what is motivating a young person to vape or use any other kind of substance or other nicotine product. It's typically things like social pressures, curiosity, a means to cope with stress. Maybe it's to boost their attention or their awareness or their ability to stay awake, to study late. Because again, remember, nicotine is a stimulant. It kind of heightens your attention and awareness. And most commonly to relieve symptoms of stress, anxiety, depression. Again, once we understand the reasons why a young person is doing these things, we can help them find a healthier way to achieve, to kind of meet and manage those motivations. We can't do that if we just sort of crack down and shut the conversation down. So we really want to understand the why. And the other thing we really want to do is challenge perceptions of what is considered normal in their peer group. Many young people and their parents think everyone's vaping, everyone's doing this and that. So it becomes like normalized for them. And what we want to do is really not make stuff up. The statistics really do show that most kids are not vaping. If you remember those earlier slides, I mean, the numbers have gone to maybe 10% or under. That means the majority of kids are not using nicotine products, and we want to normalize not using these products instead of kind of making it seem like throw our hands up because everyone's doing it anyway. One really interesting thing we've learned from our efforts to reduce smoking among young people is to kind of leverage what we know is important to our kids when we try and talk with them about reasons not to use a certain substance. So when it comes to vaping, we could talk, if your child is really interested in their academics and their grades, we could talk about the importance of avoiding nicotine products for as long as possible to allow their brain to develop in a healthy way. If your child is concerned about money, having money, we want to emphasize financial independence and the fact that buying these products and spending a lot of money on them is not consistent with becoming financially independent. If a child has mental health issues, we want to talk about how even though it may seem to temporarily alleviate some of those symptoms, in the long term, it is just going to exacerbate or make those symptoms worse. Some kids really kind of get interested in this like kind of anti-corporate mentality, anti-capitalism, whatever you want to call it. But, the fact is that these industries are targeting young people just so that they can make money. They do not have their health and welfare in mind. They just kind of want to turn a profit. So often, if we can help kids understand that the celebrity endorsements and the stars that they're interested in and the things that they're seeing in the media that are positive when it comes to nicotine product use is really a function of big corporations trying to make a lot of money off their health. That could sometimes help spur some thought among a young person who otherwise would just kind of mindlessly use these products. For those kids who are really interested in athletic performance, if they're on a team, they may feel like it's sort of maybe boosting their energy in the short term, but what we want to really talk about is explain how vaping interferes with their respiratory function, their lung functioning, their cardiac health, and therefore their stamina. So it could really have a negative effect on their performance. A lot of kids just kind of, as they're becoming teenagers, young adults, they really value their independence. And again, if we could show how nicotine addiction takes away your real independence in a way, any kind of addiction does, you're sort of, you know, you're dependent on the substance in order to function. It's also a form of conformity. A lot of young people don't want to feel like they're conforming. So those are things to talk about. And again, we have some kids who are really concerned about the environment. As Corey mentioned, especially the products that are in favor now, which are the disposable vapes. Those are made of plastics and metals that do not disappear anytime soon from our environment. They're tossed on the ground, they're tossed to the side, and they cause tremendous environmental damage. So again, the point here is to really think about what's important to your child and to try and highlight those issues when communicating with them about using these products. And then, as is true for any kind of substance use, if a young person is vaping or using other nicotine products, what we want to focus on is helping them, not punishing them. So we want to focus on the health and safety of our children. We want to recognize how addiction is a serious problem and how even an adult, or especially like we know a lot of adults who, let's say, have smoked cigarettes their whole life, how difficult it is to quit. These products really capture the brain and take over, and it's very, very hard to quit. So we don't want to just kind of be mad at our kids for using and yelling at them. If a young person is using regularly, what we want to do is get them some help. We know that most young people who use nicotine want to quit. There's research showing that about half of those who currently smoke or vape report that they would like to quit this year. This is recent data. It's very hard to quit nicotine products. So you may need to help them get professional help. So that could be counseling. Various forms of therapies are quite effective. There are nicotine replacement therapies and medications that could work. And so that would be something to talk about with your pediatrician or a counselor. And there are also things that kids and adults can do on their own. There are text messaging programs that are really effective to provide online support for a young person and guide them through the quitting process or reducing their use. And there are parallel kind of text messaging programs, especially like we have those at Partnership to End Addiction to support parents in supporting their kids to to move on and not use vaping products. So I think we'll skip to the resources just real quick, Corey. I just do want to highlight these, and hopefully these will be shared with you. There are some really, really good resources out there to help a young person who is vaping and also to understand more about these issues. So Partnership to End Addiction has a whole vaping resource page. The government has several really useful tools and resources out there. And there's a nonprofit organization called the Truth Initiative that has a great quitting resources for young people specifically. So all these QR codes will take you to the relevant pages when you get these slides. And we also like to just emphasize that we have really helpful guides for families on the topics not only of vaping, but other related issues like how to raise resilient kids and some of the co-occurring mental health and substance use issues that we've talked about. We have what we call playbooks for parents of tweens and teens that give a lot of great information on how to communicate with young people about these issues. And Partnership to End Addiction has direct support services that are free to parents and other caregivers that provide information and support for you as you're trying to help a young person in your life, stay away from substances or deal with them if they have already begun using. And with that, I'd like to give our contact information. This is for me and Corey and our colleague Janelle. If anything came up that you didn't have a chance to ask about, or something that comes up later on, or you want some more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to help in any way we can. And I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any. And if not, I'll just pass it back to Corey and
All right, it looks like no
yeah, there we go.
questions. Oh, wait, do we have one? I don't think so.
Nope.
Okay, no questions. But if anything does pop up, please feel free to reach out to either Linda or Corey, or you can reach out to us